Hi everyone, welcome to the first masterclass of Investival. My name's Becky Johnson. I'm one of the conference directors here. I am acting purely as a sort of a live signpost for this session. So it is very much the masterclass from Bird and Bird, protecting your IP and innovation. Just while we're waiting for a couple of people to join, a couple of admin points to follow. If you would like to ask a question throughout the masterclass, you can do so in two ways. First of all, in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure everyone is very used to using that. Or alternatively, there is also a reactions button. If you click on that, it's a little smiley face. You then have the option to raise your hand. Whilst the slides are being presented, however, I suggest that the easiest way to ensure that your question doesn't get lost is to put it into the chat function. Both Sally and James will sort of pause at various points in order for any questions to be answered. So please do make sure that you do that. So enough from me. Without further ado, Sally and James, over to you.
Thanks, Becky. So welcome everybody. James and I are both partners at Bird and Bird. I'm in the transactional IP group and James is in the corporate group. And we work sort of hand in glove on transactions. Given the type of firm that Bird and Bird is, a lot of our clients have innovation and technology and intellectual property at the heart of their businesses. And so whether you've got a corporate transaction or any other sort of transaction, we find that we have a lot to offer each other. So we're hoping to do a bit of a double-hander on this. As Becky said, we are interested in your comments and observations. There is essentially, there are three sections to our talk today. And perhaps the best way of dealing with questions would be to have them at the end of each section. So the first section is the importance of effectively protecting your innovation. What innovations should be protected and how, and so on. And so this is essentially a sort of IP type section. The next one is a bit more about the drafting of licenses, pitfalls that you often come across and how perhaps to avoid those. So again, at the end of that, if there's something that comes up in that section, please do raise a question. And then just generally gaining maximum commercial benefit from your investment in R&D, about partnerships, about control and seeking opportunities. And again, do sort of join in the dialogue that James and I will be having at that stage.
Just to add from my end, this is James, we'll throw in along the way a couple of sort of war stories or observations and sort of examples where we've seen things in transactions which are always worth bearing in mind, just to try and illustrate the points a little bit more for everyone on the call today. Absolutely,
thank you. So the first section is about the importance of effectively protecting your innovation. And the fact is, whether you are operating a large multinational corporation or a computer consulting firm or a medium to small manufacturer, innovation is the driving force for any small business that wants to, a successful business that wants to move forward. All companies pretty much innovate in one way or another. And perhaps some don't realize quite how much they innovate. The most successful companies do a good job of recognizing which innovations provide a competitive advantage and properly protect those inventions. Now, in large multinational companies, protecting innovation could be seen as easy because it's got pretty much unlimited resources to invest heavily in IP teams. But for small and medium-sized manufacturers or innovators, it's not always so easy. So these companies need to pick and choose which innovations need to be protected. And regardless of size, it's really important to have a comprehensive plan for identifying and protecting the right innovations to give the company a leg up in competition. So how do you do that? Firstly, you need to recognize it, and you need systems in place. And one of the most important things is to get employees and those at the front end to be educated about what they're actually looking for, and perhaps to incentivize them. Certainly in Germany, which is one of the most prolific patenting sectors or companies, the employees have big financial incentives to obtaining patents. So funnily enough, by providing those incentives, there are lots more patents that come through the system. Now, it's not a panacea, and you don't just want a sort of scattergun of all sorts of patents coming through, but you do need the people who are innovating to have some interest in it, some passion about it, and also an understanding about what they're aiming for and how they need to protect it. It's a good idea to have a regular review with IP specialists. In a big company, this would likely be an in-house patent group. But you can use outside consultants together with business development people and marketeers to say, well, what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to get there? Before you actually get to patenting anything, you will have inventions and innovations which need to be treated as trade secrets. And in some ways, having a good trade secrets policy should be taken in tandem with a good patenting strategy. So it's so important that these keen engineers or scientists or whatever who are making the innovations understand the importance of keeping everything secret, because as a lot of you will know, once something is disclosed, it can no longer be patented. So there is a temptation sometimes to go early to say, look at this wonderful thing that we're working on. But unfortunately, you've then shared that with the world, lost the right to a trade secret, and also lost the opportunity to patent something. So when do you do it? So we talk about educating the employees, having a strategy so that you know what you're going to look for, and make sure that there is a regular system for reporting inventions and knowing what to do with those, and get someone to value the opportunity, whether it's worth patenting, whether it would be better to keep as a trade secret for financial or long-term reasons, because a trade secret maintains its value for as long as the quality of confidentiality is maintained, whereas a patent has a finite value. So think about what level of protection is needed. It could be that a design is a more appropriate type of protection. You have unregistered and registered designs. It could be that you have copyright in something that's actually more of a sort of software concept. But again, there are good processes for bringing ownership of copyright to parties' attention so that you start on the upper foot. Most important, can't emphasize it enough, that you must ensure there's no premature, inadvertent disclosure and therefore loss of protection. It's worth remembering that it's been analysed that for generally in technology-rich environments, about 8 to 12% of gross revenue is allocated to R&D. So it's so important that that investment is treated properly, and everything that can be protected is protected so that it can be exploited in the correct way going forward. So just going a little bit more into that, patents, a robust portfolio So that's one way you're not going to be challenged by all your competitors because you've done the patenting effectively and strongly. It can prevent, you can have a sort of, an aggressive way of setting up your portfolio, which prevents the others coming in to compete. Now, it was a few decades ago, I was working in-house in a company that where all our competitors and we were working on the next level of chemistry and science. And everyone knew everyone was working in the same area of chemistry, but our patent agents got there within days with the first perfect patent. And that meant that all our competitors needed to come and take licenses for us. The exploitation of that, both for ourselves and through licensees, was absolutely immense. And it was, even though this is one of the biggest, at the time, it's one of the biggest companies, certainly in the UK, if not the world, it made a difference to the share price because that patenting strategy was so important. I've mentioned, it's not just what the company itself can do with a patent, but it gives us an opportunity to seek licensing revenue. The advantage of a patent, if you've got plenty of money, is that the coverage can be pretty much worldwide. Once you've got your foot in the door, there is, obviously, there are various areas. It is a geographic coverage, but nonetheless, it's something that's available worldwide. But of course, each time you do that, you have to go through the process of applying for a patent and maintaining it as well. It's not cheap. You need patent agents, you need local agents, and you need to make sure, of course, that what you're protecting is robust. But it does give you a period of monopoly, and it's the sort of thing, I'm sure James would support this, that investors love to see, a nice, robust portfolio. Of course, it's not, as I've mentioned, it's not always the ideal way of protecting an invention. And in some environments, trade secrets are seen as preferable, and they are being, in the Europe, they've been given a bit more sort of value and a sort of sense of value. So, savvy executives will know when to forego patent protection in lieu of trade secret protection. It could be because even giving a hint to the competitors means that actually they get an idea of what you're doing, and they may work on workarounds, which means you've lost that competitive advantage. And also, as I said, if it's a really strong and long-lasting invention, then it may be valuable for longer than 20 years, and you don't want that value to come to an end, that protection. Equally, it may well be the position that protecting the invention is simply not worth the investment, and you're just happy to keep it as a trade secret. Then you will need the processes to maintain trade secrets. So timing is everything. When it comes to exploitation, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I've mentioned licensing. I mentioned in the company that I worked for that we would need licenses from other companies. We would fill our pipeline with licenses from perhaps smaller companies that needed a bigger partner to take a product to the market, or we had licensees or licensors in geographic places where we didn't have a franchise, or in different areas of chemistry or science where we needed a supporter. But licensing can be a very significant part of royalty income. We've seen it in telecoms, we see it in pharmaceuticals, see it in biotech, that actually part of the model is about licensing. And of course, if you've got a strong patent or set of patents, then that can provide a really valuable bargaining chip for cross-licensing. So you can get the best inventions back in, and you've got a much stronger portfolio as a result. So you need to balance what you want to use yourself and what would be better to exploit through or together with a third party. So what will investors look for in terms of IP protection? I'm sure James will want to leap in that. I've mentioned a strong IP portfolio, identifying and protecting key assets. It's often the first question that we do. And where you have exclusivity in a particular technology, obviously it gives you valuable control over access to the market. If you're the first there, you're sort of playing the chess game with everybody else. Patents, because they are registered right and they're on a record and everybody can see them. And in fact, everyone will check what is going on in a particular technological area. They're seen as hard and therefore quite valuable assets, and perhaps have higher value than something softer like copyright or indeed trade secrets. It has a defensive value as well. If in doing searches, a company is looking to assert its own IP, or perhaps to attack another, if you've got a really good patent portfolio, of course, they're going to say, gosh, they've really got themselves sorted out. This is going to be too expensive and painful to deal with. And equally, when talking about registered rights, a good trademark or design right, or both, or together with patents, portfolio really shows that you're on top of your business. It's put every third party on notice that you've got, and it's up to any other company to attack you rather than the other way around. And the third part of a good discipline is to have good copyright discipline, so that you're basically making third parties prove that they didn't copy from you, rather than you having to defend yourself. James, you're in these conversations.
Yes, and then stepping back a bit more broadly, as either sort of corporate lawyer tends to do, if I'm looking at sort of corporate transactions, the issues that often come up where companies have perhaps not necessarily looked after their IP appropriately often include things like, does the IP actually show as being owned by the company? It's not uncommon, especially for emerging biotechs, where maybe something's being done by an individual before the company's been incorporated. Has that IP then been transferred into the company appropriately, or signed into the company? Making sure that's being done correctly and documented appropriately is important. Do the employment contracts for all the key individuals who are creating this IP, perhaps developing the patents, is that all watertight? Does it show that the IP has been, subject to the terms of their employment contract, transferred to the company? It's owned by the company. Deficiencies there can cause issues, which you then need to rectify, and it can be more costly to rectify it than getting those employment contracts correct from the get-go. Have you got a good data room where you've set things up appropriately, whether it's a transaction with a counterparty where you're opening up a data room, or it's an investment or collaboration, whatever the type of transaction? If you've got everything in a well-ordered manner, you've set out what your IPs are, you've got folders with the key documents, not disclosing certain documents. As Sally said earlier, there may be certain sort of information relating to patents that you don't want to disclose. So having a broader document that alludes to what's there, but not actually disclosing the information can be important. So just making sure that you've managed that information appropriately. You've got records of who's seen what, and so you can know who you've divulged it to. That's all important in terms of making sure that investors or counterparties can get comfortable with the way that you're looking after your IP assets, and because they are often communicated, a lot of confidential information is communicated. Making sure that you've got a record of who's received what is important, especially if you're in negotiations with multiple parties. Controlling who gets information is important. You don't want to just divulge it to anyone, and ensuring that you've obviously got NDAs in place where you are divulging that information is exceptionally important as well. So having a good, strong, robust NDA on your books is important, and making sure that you enter into that each time is also equally important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Does that's the end of section 1. Have we received any questions? Because I'm screen sharing, I can't actually see. I'll just ask Becky.
Not at the moment, Sally. So I think obviously a reminder, if anyone does have questions, just pop them in the chat. But for the moment, I think everyone's just sort of taking in the information. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Right. So the next stage, it is a licensing masterclass. We're going to look at some sort of typical pitfalls in research, collaborations, and licenses, and partnerships, and perhaps how best to avoid them. So the first thing is the scope of the license, and the devil is really in the detail, and it really is so important to set out in sufficient details that you don't have a dispute further down the line. And we'll come to milestones, which I would say is probably the biggest source of dispute when collaborations go wrong, but also elements within the scope of the license can give rise to disputes, particularly if there's sloppy drafting or if there's some sort of difference in expectation. So first thing, obviously, some of these things might seem terribly obvious, but it's surprising what we see or receive to comment on sometimes, where things are just left hanging. But so what is licensed if you're in? Well, the patent rights, so far so good. You can license the patent. You can put a schedule of patent rights with numbers. But anyone who's involved in this sort of high, fast-moving, innovative business will know that that's only part of the story. There may well be know-how or confidential information that is of equal value, and will need to be access to that will need to be to be granted. But of course, you need to be very careful about the circumstances under which that know-how can be used, and how the confidentiality is going to be made. There may be other data that can't be protected in any registered way, but can have huge, huge value. Improvements is a huge area, particularly in collaboration. Possibly both parties are working on improving what is being licensed. Who has what rights to those improvements? Or if you're just a licensee and you've taken the right to some licenses, if there are improvements to that, there are future patents, do you have an automatic right to that? It would be quite a big ask to have a right to that without paying any more money, but you need to deal with somehow how that would deal with. Otherwise, the license that you've paid for might in the long run have a rather limited use. Also, patent rights, you'll normally include applications as well. And you would probably have trademarks as well, registered, unregistered, and so on. You have unregistered rights, such as copyright. But I think the patents is where a lot of the issues arise. So, in giving a license, it's important that you actually set out what the licensee can actually do with the rights that they are granted. As if you are the licensor, you may want it to be quite limited because you want to retain some rights for yourself, or you're going to give them to a third party. If you're the licensee, you'll want this list of rights that are granted to be as long as possible, so that you're pretty free to act. So as well as the patents, you might have rights to a product made as a result of making something with a patent. And what can you do with that product? Can you make it? Are you able to keep or stock it, dispose of it, offer it to dispose of? There's sort of various levels in this. Import it, if you have a right to write, can you do research on it? Can you develop it? Can you export it? Can you get another party to make it for you or to sell it on behalf of you? And as a licensee, it's very important that you get this absolutely clear. And as licensed, if you don't want them fiddling about with your invention, then for goodness sake, make it absolutely clear. But if it's not in the list, say, for the avoidance of doubt, you don't have the right to research or develop it or reverse engineer or whatever. You can also have process patents. Those as well have great value. And you'll probably be aware that process patents can be a way of sort of extending the life of, say, a pharmaceutical product, because if you found a way of making that product much more efficiently and therefore much more cheaply, so that any competitors who want to sell your product, the original patent might have gone out of date. They can't really compete in the generic market because you've got the way of processing or manufacturing that product very efficiently. So again, you have process patents, and a bit like the product patent, there'll be various things that you can do or not do with the products that come out of that process. And again, specify know-how and what you could do with it there. The scope of the license also involves what sort of exclusivity. Non-exclusive, it's sort of free for all. Now, the one I really want to flag up here is sole and co-exclusive, because these have different meanings in the US and basically in the EU and UK. Sole in the EU and the UK means that the licensor will retain a right to use or exploit the patent itself, as well as its licensee, but it won't have a right to license anybody else. That expression in the UK actually means the same as exclusive. So you might see a license that refers to sole and exclusive license. Unfortunately, without further explanation, that's pretty meaningless, because it begs the question, does the licensor have the right to use the product itself, the patent itself? And exclusivity can be a valuable tool. It could be in various fields, and that field could be a technical field or a market field, or a geographic field, such as different territories. So the same invention can be made to work really, really hard by being licensed several times over. Important to see, and in the past, some licensees have come a cropper, because they sort of assume that, say, if one party gets a license, then all its affiliates do. That is not an assumption. But equally, if you say the license applies to party and all its affiliates, that is no longer an exclusive license. And as such, you can find that you lose some of the quality of exclusivity. So it's really important to sort of set out what the rights are. In fact, it's better from a structural point of view to have one licensee, which is purely an exclusive license, and that licensee has a right to sub-license to its affiliates. And then you keep that original relationship as being exclusive. So financial terms, there's often a license fee for getting access to the invention in the first place. This might be upfront, and these fees can be quite substantial. And often the upfront is to sort of help a smaller licensor perhaps to get to the next stage of invention. There may be an annual fee to be paid to keep your right to use that license. You can see that the license fee is set off against royalties that are paid in due course. So the royalties may be payable on sale of widgets, or total sales, or actual numbers of products, and that can be quite interesting, but it does mean you're sort of mortgaging your investment somewhat. If you are the licensor, you may well want to inflation proof these license fees. Who knows what's going to happen in inflation in these uncertain times? You wouldn't want in a long-term license to find that what seemed to be quite an attractive annual fee becomes all but worthless over time. Now, milestones can be a source of a lot of dispute where they're not properly drafted, where there's too much sort of, oh, we'll see what happens. But basically you can have regulatory or development milestones. So, reaching a particular point in the regulatory process, finishing phase 2 trials or whatever, or development milestones such as getting to a certain proof of concept. And you can imagine if one party wants that concept to be proved, the other party doesn't, then it can give rise to dispute about whether that concept was actually proved, whether enough subjects have come through the phase 2 trials. You can have sales milestones, which mean that a particular royalty rate kicks in. James and I have each seen, is working out what gets included in that definition of sales. You can go on for pages about what's included and what's not included, but you almost can't be too safe. And then it's up to the parties. They may want other milestones such as first sale in a particular territory or whatever. Did you want to leave them there, or should we do milestones later, James?
Just an interest of time.
Okay, right. So, yes, reminder on time. So you need to identify these things very carefully. What IP exploitation generates a royalty, whether it's processes, services, or products made as a result of using the patent. All these definitions need to be so carefully set out because a lot of money sort of relies on them. There's debate about, well, can royalties continue to be paid after expiry of patents? Situation slightly different in the US from the UK, in that you actually can't in the US, but depending on how you sort of structure royalties, it is possible that royalties are payable after the expiry of patents, either because you're saying some of it is payable later, or perhaps you're still paying for an access to know-how or whatever. I've just seen that I'm running a bit late. So I think really there is some things, there's a lot of detail to be included in how you get to the financial provisions, and it's so important, what's payable on what and how, and if it's in a combination, how do you determine whether how one bit of an invention is encompassed in a combination product, for example. On IP, really important to establish who's going to determine and who's going to pay for the patenting of the product, and in fact, who's going to defend it. And if you have got infringements to deal with and defenses, it could be that if one party pays, then they get the benefit of anything. The most important thing is to determine who has the right to choose and whether the other party has the right to contribute to that decision, or if it's in good faith and they can challenge whether the patenting choice was actually done in good faith. It can go wrong, and also, you know, there can be disputes about where one party chooses not to pursue patents or SPCs or whatever, and then of course the value of the investment goes away, but there's nothing you can do because the other party has the right. I mentioned milestone because I think it's quite an interesting area, and as I mentioned, it's one that can give rise, in my experience, to dispute more than anything else. So the sort of things that I've seen, an activity milestone such as recruitment of a number of people, making a certain number of visits to hospitals or doctors if you're in pharmaceuticals. I think I've alluded to some of these others about proof of concept, phase 2 trials, first commercial sales. And I just can't emphasize how important it is, firstly, to draft these carefully and to have a dispute system in case the parties can't agree. Do you refer it to a third party? You don't necessarily want to go to court because that will hold things up whilst everything's being held up. Obviously, sales aren't being made, or the same effort won't be put into the project as could have been. Because basically, there can be significant sums and indeed go and no-go decisions. I think I'd like to get to the last slide, most of all, on dispute resolution. There are so many areas that that disputes can arise. They might be financial. They can often be about the amount of efforts put in. So just try and see where the squeeze points are and get the drafting right. And then you can play all sorts of games about jurisdiction and you know, whether you go for arbitration, mediation, or whatever. And there, I've got a list, the sort of things to think about in relation to dispute resolution. If you can get these things right, if the worst comes to the worst, hopefully you're not going to spend a year or two determining how you're going to resolve the dispute, but just get on with resolving it. So the final bit is, you know, gaining maximum commercial benefit from your investment in R&D. So James, thoughts on right collaboration partners? I've sort of put a few thoughts up there.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important one that sometimes gets slightly overlooked. Making sure you're collaborating with the right partner, not just at the corporate level, but also at the individual level, is actually really important. You know, making sure that you're both equally committed to the business, you know, probably sketching out a term sheet to agree the outline of a transaction to make sure that you're on the same page is a good thing to do. Developing detailed business plans and milestones to make sure that you have got that sort of transaction in mind, and then you can then go ahead and negotiate it and look to complete it. And finding the right partner with the right complementary skills or markets or intelligence or know-how they can bring to that is incredibly important. And you know, Sally put here on the fourth bullet point, enjoy spending time with your business partner. I think that's also pretty important. And I give here a little bit of a warning. And that was many years ago, I negotiated a joint venture in the biotech space, and the two clients, our client on the other side, really didn't like each other. And the negotiations had become quite fraught. Both companies were struggling financially. And as a result of that, the negotiations were hard fought. And we actually got sort of 7 or 8 weeks down the line, we actually negotiated and completed the entire joint venture agreement, and we sent it out for signing. And the following morning, we were told that they'd walked away. They decided actually it was the worst thing both parties could do because they didn't like each other on a personal level. From a corporate perspective, the deal sort of made sense, but they didn't think it was actually going to work day in, day out when you're collaborating. And because you're collaborating, the key is in the word. You need to make sure you've got a good working relationship day in, day out. And you need to be able to then, if you do hit a bump in the road where maybe you have a disagreement, you need to think you've got a good relationship so that you can navigate through that and carry on. What you don't want is to be coming at it from the first position of you're at loggerheads with each other, and therefore it can degenerate into a dispute fairly quickly. So that's actually you know, one of the sort of softer things. It's not something necessarily you can quantify easily, but it's incredibly important into ensuring that you get a successful collaboration or transaction.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen things as well where actually it's almost been, there's been a commercial need, or both parties thought they needed a transaction, but actually things only start on signing. And if you don't get it wrong, you need to know they're all pulling in the same direction.
And I think the other point here that Sally's made, which is really important, is making sure that you've got appropriate controls in your investment or collaboration documentation. Do you have the information that you need, audit rights, information, controls, veto rights, consent rights that you need to ensure that you've got the appropriate checks and balances in the deal with the other side? And of course, they will be expecting the same back from you. And so there is an element of what you demand, you may have to give with the other hand. And so just making sure that you've got that in a balanced manner is very important. Obviously, having trust in your partner is also important. I think the last point here, which is also exceptionally important, is when you're talking about your crown jewels, which the IP in your company no doubt is, then it's important to ensure that you're entering into transactions in a considered way, in a methodical way. You get the documentation, the right advisors in place, and then you get the right documentation drafted and negotiated appropriately, and you take your time with it. You don't want to be overly rushing something and perhaps making those mistakes in perhaps the commercial terms or the drafting. And one thing that you might say, a lawyer would say this, but I think it's pretty important, is I've sometimes seen clients go off and negotiate term sheets not fully aware of what they're signing, and then they've made a mistake. Particularly for the earlier stage companies amongst you, making sure that you've got a chance to discuss it with a lawyer, make sure you understand all the key points and have thought them through is exceptionally important, and avoids making sort of mistakes along the way. I think with that, we should probably just open it up for any questions. We've got a few minutes. If anyone does have any questions, then please let Sally and me know. Either through the chat, as Becky indicated earlier, or raise your hand.
Yeah.
Alternatively, as Joe, my colleague, has just put in the chat function, if you want to obviously ask Sally or James privately, and you don't want to obviously post in what is quite a public forum, then I'm sure Sally and James will be happy to answer them. But we
Absolutely.
do have time for probably one or two questions if anyone has it.
Or indeed observations, if anyone's sort of seen anything in action that we've been talking about today.
Perhaps.
Oh, sorry, James, go on.
So as I say, obviously the nature of the session means we've covered this at a fairly high level today. Obviously, there's obviously layers of detail that go well beyond the scope of today's session, but are obviously exceptionally important.
I think everyone's perhaps being a little bit shy at this sort of this morning. So I mean, Sally and James, I don't know if you've got something to sort of just add before we close the forum. Sort of final thoughts, I guess. Oh, you're on mute, Sally.
Sorry, because I had a coughing fit. I managed to get this far without coughing, which was quite an achievement. But I can't emphasize there's sort of the soft stuff that we've talked about at the end, although that's absolutely it's so important. But also I can't overemphasize the importance of the detail in the other stuff that we talked about, in the pitfalls and so on. You can try and plan for the future, for the unexpected. But don't rely too much on, oh, we'll sort it out down the line. We'll sort it out down the line. Oh, the milestones. Oh, we'll agree that it's been achieved or something. Put some objective criteria in about obtaining milestones, so that you say, oh, right, okay, 25 subjects have been through phase 2 trials, and yep, signed off, go. The more you rely on the parties agree that something's been achieved, the more likely it is that the parties don't agree. And whilst that's fine, the collaboration may have come to an end. If it's a bad end to a collaboration, then you're going to be spending time and money trying to unpick things. Whereas if you've prepared properly for a go, no-go decision, then that's going to be a much more organized end to the relationship.
Sally, just to jump in, apologies. We do actually have a question from Salma. She's raised her hand,
Salma.
or she has raised his hand. Apologies. So Salma, if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to ask it.
Hi there. Sorry, I just sent Jo a question directly to her rather than in the chat. I just wanted to explore this. So we've certainly had discussions in our license agreement, certainly for therapeutics, where we want to have a royalty rate provision around beyond the expiry of a valid claim. And I was just wondering various ways of how you address them in your licenses. I know we've tried regulatory data exclusivity and things like that, but sometimes we get real pushback.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering whether you've come up with some creative, genius ideas of how you address that.
So essentially, two ways. One is to say that the payment for the patent is actually going to be amortized over a period that goes beyond the expiry of a valid claim under the patent. So, and there is a justification for that, because you can say, well, yes, the patent was from X. Actually, it took us a while to build up the market, and actually the real benefit from having access to this patent only came into being, and we couldn't afford to pay all these royalties earlier on. So if both parties agree, we've successfully argued that that is a way, or effectively, it does quite genuinely have to be an amortization of the patent royalty that's just approached slightly differently. What you can't say is that you're paying for access to a patent because the patent no longer exists. But know-how can be very valuable, and indeed access to a marketing authorization again. Now, if you're relying on the latter two, I would suggest you probably need to adjust the royalty rate at the date of expiry of the patent, because it's harder to justify. Say, well, you've had the access to the know-how throughout, but you also had access to the patent. How come it's the same price with or without the patent?
Yeah.
So those are the two things that I've done in the past, and I feel quite happy doing that. I think if you're genuinely trying to squeeze some income out of a patent that's come to the end of its life, then you're not going to have a happy time. Also, big house warning, there was a very big case involving Star Wars figures. It wasn't actually patents, but it was another registered right at the time. And the US courts came down very heavy on the licensor who was trying to continue his exclusive access.
Yeah, it's interesting. We certainly haven't tried the patent amortization, but the discussions we've previously had are again around know-how, with a reduction in royalty rate and potentially the marketing authorization. And how would you address, say, a patent is pending in patent territories or is granted, but there are also sales in non-patent territories?
So
can you get people to agree to a royalty rate payment whilst patent is pending in patented territories?
Yes, I've seen a case where there are actually a whole bunch of different royalty rates according to whether what sort of territory it is, whether it's big territory or a smaller one, whether there's a valid patent or not. But then it's actually because you're getting access to the know-how.
Yeah.
And the fact is, if they've got, even if they've got a patent license in another territory, if they have a license to whatever you've got in a non-patent territory, then it means that they wouldn't be breaching patent in, perhaps exporting or whatever. Or if you do get a patent there, but I would say it's normally dealt with by a variety of different royalty rates.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for that. Sorry, I hogged you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Salma. And Sally and James, we're going to have to sort of stop it there.
Thank you, everyone.
So and we have actually had a question that's come through from Orlean. Apologies for the pronunciation, I'm sure it's incorrect, but which unfortunately don't have time to get to. It's around copyright management, but if as I said, you reach out directly to James and or Sally, I know that they'll be more than happy to answer
Absolutely.
it. So thank you so much, James and Sally, and thank you to everyone for joining us today.